A few weeks ago, Curtis asked me if I would get up and do a talk on forgiveness, and I thought, well, okay, my first thought was I'm kind of excited about that. That's pretty easy. I know lots of things that I can talk about as it relates to forgiveness, and there's lots of neat stories in the Bible that relate to forgiveness, and I thought that'll be an easy one for me. I can just throw that together. It won't take a whole lot of effort. And as I started kind of piecing it together and thinking through it a little bit, I got to thinking, well, I don't really have any forgiveness issues myself, right? This wasn't one of these moments that, wow, this just hits me and it was real relevant to me. And I thought, well, that's okay. I'll put together the talk anyway. And this will just be one of those talks that's maybe for everybody else's benefit and not mine, right? It's one of those weeks. And so as I'm putting it together and I started going through some things, it was like, wow, am I wrong on this one? I was really wrong on this one. And all of a sudden, just sort of seemingly out of nowhere, there was just like one punch, then another coming at me of things that were related to forgiveness in my life. And clearly, it was one of these moments where God was trying to tell me something, right? You ever have one of those moments where it's, you got one of these types of things and you sort of keep it kind of tucked down and you don't really want to let it come to the surface, and then God just sort of has this way of yanking it right out of you whether you want him to or not. It was like one of those moments, right? And so that's kind of what I was going through, and so as I'm putting this talk together, different things that relate to forgiveness just started surfacing, and I want to take a little bit of time today and kind of go through a few of those and share a couple stories and a couple things out of the Bible that I think will help us understand this. But before we jump into some of those, I want to take a moment and I kind of look at forgiveness, and there's really maybe two areas that I think people primarily struggle with forgiveness. And the first area of those is that they struggle to forgive others. And for some of you today, you might be here saying, hey, that's me. That's me. I struggle to forgive others. And some of you might say, for me, I can't seem to forgive others that have hurt me. I can't seem to get past those that have wronged me and find forgiveness for those. And if that's you today, and if that's where you're at with your life, I hope that as we go through this talk, we can unpack a few different ideas, a few different things that will help you move past this through some of the teachings in the Bible. A couple weeks ago, a few weeks ago now, I guess it was, I heard a story. And I wanted to share it with you guys because it was relevant to this talk this morning. There was a gal who attends a church here in Minnesota somewhere, and at her church, they do something kind of interesting and unique each week. Somebody from the congregation is asked to stand up and read a Bible verse. And whatever that Bible verse is it ties into whatever the talk's going to be for that week. And it just so happened that this very week, the Bible verse that she was going to be reading on was forgiveness. And she didn't know it going into the verse. She didn't know that's what it was going to be. And so they called on this very unsuspecting person that was sitting in the audience, and they asked her to stand up and read this verse on forgiveness. And this week in this particular church, their talk happened to be on forgiveness. And as she started to go through this verse, it was interesting. The emotion sort of overtook her, and it was a little bit overwhelming. And let me explain to you why, and show you a little bit of what was going on in her life. So this gal, she had a son, and recently her son had been walking down the side of a road, and while walking down the side of the road, he was struck by a car and he was killed. And it was one of these situations where the driver hit her son, killed her son, proceeded a few blocks down the road, parked the car, got out of the car, decided to go off to wherever he went off to. And unfortunately, they weren't able to track this person down until some point, I think, the next day. And by the time they came to this person, the evidence the night before would have indicated that there was probably drinking involved. Maybe it was the time of night. Maybe it was some of the evidence that they found in the car. I don't know. But all things pointed to the fact that there was probably drinking involved. By the time they got to the person that owned the car, what they found out was that he was no longer drunk, and also that the person said, it wasn't me. I didn't do it. And so I wasn't the one driving the car. Not sure how my car ended up over there on that highway, but it wasn't me. And through the process of this, they weren't able to ever figure out, who did this and if it was this person. But seemingly it was the person that owned the vehicle. And at the end of this, what ultimately the horrible part of this story is that you got a mom who lost a son, right? And you got a mom who is struggling day to day, and she's struggling to get past this anger,
this animosity toward this other person. And really, she wasn't looking for a conviction. She wasn't looking for this person to spend eternity in prison. What she was looking for was she just wanted the person to admit what they did wrong so that she could find peace in her heart, so that she could move past it and she could put it as a chapter in her past. But as long as this person wasn't willing to admit what they did, she wasn't able to move past it. And, let me say that last part again because I think it's important. And here's a mom that was holding on to anger. She was holding on to this pain, to this suffering, and she couldn't put it past her. And ultimately, it had gotten to a point really where the only person that she was still hurting was herself. She was the only one still suffering in this equation. And she needed to have a moment where she could let this go past her. And I think on this particular Sunday in this particular church, God was ready to take action. God was ready to step in and begin the healing process for this lady. And as she was reading this verse, she was overtaken by emotion, and she realized that she had finally gotten to a point with this situation that she knew what she needed to do. And what she needed to do was she needed to forgive this person and let it go. Okay, she needed to move past it and let it go. And this brings us to our first point on your outline. If you're note takers and you want to look at this, we can extend forgiveness even when it seems impossible. Even when the circumstances are impossible, even when you look at something and you think there's no way I could forgive somebody, God has another plan for you. God has a way to move you in His direction and allow this to happen. So we can extend forgiveness even when it seems impossible. In this church that this gal was attending, as is the case in many churches, probably in our church here today, there were many unfamiliar faces, people that were just visiting the church probably for the first time. Maybe they'd never been there before. Perhaps it was people that were new to church altogether, maybe people that didn't know Jesus, didn't have a relationship with Him. And interestingly, their experience for this first time in church perhaps was to see what this lady was going through, seeing what her struggle was and how she was trying to overcome the struggle of being able to forgive others and how God was moving on her at this very moment in time. After that service was over, one of the pastors of that church said something to the lady, to the mom. And it sort of stuck with me. I thought, wow, what a powerful statement. And what he said was, sometimes we are the only Bible that somebody will ever read. And sometimes we are the only Jesus somebody will ever see. And I thought, wow, that is amazing. That's powerful. And over the coming weeks, I thought about it over and over and over. And it was like one of these things I couldn't get out of my head. It's like, how do you move past that? And I started thinking, how do I apply this in this area and this area and in all these different areas of my life? And I just couldn't move past that statement. And I wanted to ask you guys today, ask yourself the question, when people see you, do they see a reflection of Jesus? When people see you, do they see a reflection of God's Word? Because truly as Christians, that's what we want to be, right? To be a Christian, to be Christ-like is what we're all striving for, and we should be a reflection of that. One of my favorite stories in the Bible is a really cool story. It's in the first book of the Bible in Genesis 37, and it's a story of a young man named Joseph. Some of you probably familiar with this story, perhaps. If you're not, maybe you were familiar with at least the kids' version of the story. It was a young boy with a colorful coat that his dad gave him. But if you're not familiar with the story, that's okay. I'm going to give you sort of the Cliff Notes version because it's really long, and we'd have to be here most of the afternoon for me to break the whole thing down. But you've got a story of a young man named Joseph, and Joseph was the second youngest in a family of boys of 11 boys. Okay, if you can imagine that, 11 boys all in one household, and he was the second youngest. And in his household, he was the favorite, right? And any of you that have brothers or sisters and or children, you probably understand that it's never a good idea to have one that you favor, right? It never goes over well with everybody else. But in this case, Joseph was the favorite. And his dad, on one occasion, actually went out and bought this fancy coat for him, this coat of many colors. It was probably expensive. And I can only imagine Joseph probably wore it everywhere he went and paraded this thing around just to tell his brothers how cool he was, right? And how much he was loved. And Joseph was a good kid, but his brothers were very jealous of him. And they started to kind of get some animosity toward him and some anger towards him, and they didn't want to put up with it anymore. And ultimately, his brothers, they kind of conjured up this great idea in their head, and they thought, well, nothing else we can do at this point other than I think we probably need to kill him. Okay, so this was their solution to their little brother. And so they set out one day and they came up with this plot, and they thought, okay, we're going to kill him, we're going to throw him down in this well, and we're going to leave him there. And it was this crazy idea that they had conjured up. Well, while Joseph is sitting down in this well and probably waiting to die, probably afraid, as luck would have it, I think it was truly an intervention from God, actually. There just happened to be passing by at this very moment a group of slave traders. And as these slave traders were passing by, I don't know, one of his brothers, two of his brothers, they sort of came to their senses and they thought, wait a second, we don't want to kill this brother of ours, right? Then we got blood on our hands. We got to deal with that for the rest of our lives. I don't want to have that guilt. We could do something much better than that. Why don't we just sell him into slavery, right? Much better idea, right? Now, I know, be honest with me out there, there's at least one or two of you out there that have thought about selling your brother or sister, right? Okay, so here they wanted to sell their brother down into slavery, and it's exactly what they ended up doing. And they took his coat of many colors, they dipped it in blood, they shredded it, they brought it home to Dad, and they said, Dad, we found this coat of your son's, and he must have been devoured by wild animals, and he's no more. And so sort of to fast forward a little bit here in the story, Joseph, he moves on. He ends up getting purchased by a wealthy person in Egypt by the name of Potiphar. And Potiphar is the head of the palace guard and a pretty important person, seemingly. And Joseph was this amazing guy that had this incredible connection with God. And Potiphar quickly realized that everything Joseph did sort of turned to gold. Everything Joseph was involved in was successful. And pretty soon he started handing over things to Joseph. And he thought, well, man, this guy's so amazing, and God is truly with him. I'm going to have him take over my finances, my household, my family dealings. And so Joseph becomes in charge of a little bit of everything for this guy. And one day, while he was off, while Potiphar was off doing whatever Potiphar does, Joseph was home with Potiphar's wife. And the Bible tells us that Joseph was a pretty attractive young man. I can only imagine he probably looked a lot like me, bald, great-looking cat, right? But they say he was a good-looking guy, and Potiphar's wife decides that this is an opportunity that she wants to sort of put on some of her best moves on Joseph, right? And she decides to sort of advance on him. And Joseph, amazingly, Joseph wasn't having any part of it. And Joseph, even though he had the opportunity in this situation to do everything wrong, he did everything right, which is probably a whole other talk for another time and place. But here you got Joseph who made the right decision. He rejected her, and in fact, he took off running, and as he ran away, she ripped his shirt off, and he leaves the scene, right? And ultimately, Potiphar's wife, or Potiphar's husband, Potiphar, let me rephrase that. Ultimately, Potiphar makes his way home, and his wife says to him that actually Joseph tried to wrong her. She accuses Joseph of the wrongdoings and puts Potiphar in a really difficult situation where ultimately Potiphar is forced to put Joseph in prison, where he spends several years. Okay, so he spends several years for doing something that he really didn't do anything wrong. He did everything right. Well, a little bit further in the story, because God was so much with Joseph, eventually Joseph gets out of prison, and through a series of miracles and through God's help, Joseph becomes the second most powerful person in all the land, in all of Egypt, right? And pretty amazing story. And while this was all going on, there just so happened to be a famine in the land. There was no food, and so the people from outside of Greater Egypt, they were coming in, and they were coming into Egypt to collect their rations, to get some food for their families. And on one occasion, Joseph's brothers showed up to get food. Now, they didn't recognize Joseph. I can only imagine he had grown up. He probably looked different. He probably was dressing like an Egyptian. He didn't look anything like them, and they showed up, and they wanted to collect food, and he recognized them right away, right? He knew who they were. And so in this situation, just to kind of recap here, this is the brothers, right? The same brothers that hated him, the same brothers that sold him into slavery. They wanted to kill him. The same brothers that caused him into a life where he had to go to prison for several years. They never came and looked for him. And here they are on his doorstep asking for food, and he recognizes them. Now, how would you handle that, right? Spoiler alert, this thing did not go down like a Clint Eastwood movie, right? It didn't end like that. It wasn't Guns Ablazing. He didn't say everybody that's ever wronged me is going to be taken out here. That's not how this went down. That's probably how I would have handled it. It's not how he handled it. And in fact, he did just the opposite. He did sort of the unthinkable, and he embraced them. He fed them. He brought them into his house, and he forgave them. And ultimately, he said, my whole family, why don't you guys all come live with me here in the palace? Right? An amazing story of forgiveness that God provides us through the words of the Bible. And he shows us that even when there's no way to forgive, the most unseemly circumstance that you could imagine, he gives us a way to forgive. Now, to change gears just a bit here, it's still on the topic of forgiveness, but on a more personal level here, I don't know if any of you guys deal with this type of scenario, or maybe it's just me, maybe I'm the only one, but do any of you guys work in an office or have a coworker or work in an environment where you sort of have that office nemesis, right? That one person in your office that just gets at you, right? Nobody really likes them, but you sort of got to be nice to them, that person, right? And that person that they kind of wreak havoc on everybody, and their primary objective in life is, let's make everybody else look bad so that I look good. You know that person, right? I don't know if any of you have that person. Yeah, I was looking through the Bible the other day, and I was trying to figure out what is the biblical term for that person, and then I came across it. It was jerk. Jerk, right? And I even cross-checked it in Hebrew, Latin, still means jerk, still there. And I don't know if you guys deal with this person. Maybe it's just me, but as I look at this person, I've got one in my office. And it's sort of this daily struggle, right? It's this daily battle where I almost have to, as I'm walking to work, I have to pray to get me through this day. Help me with this battle, Lord. And there are days, I'm honest, there are days where I feel like God says to me, John, because that's what he calls me, he says, John, you are on your own on this one. You're going to have to work through this on your own. It's not like one of those footprints moments where we look down and it's just God's footprints and he's kind of carrying me through this whole thing. It doesn't usually go down like that. It's usually me trying to figure my way through this and screwing it up here and screwing it up here. And the other day as I was dealing with this, I think God sort of had a breakthrough with me, right? And it was one of these times where I was sitting there thinking in my office, and I was dealing with some of this guy's nonsense, and I was thinking, what do I do? And I thought, what about the conversation that Peter had with Jesus? And what if that was me? What if it was me that had that same conversation with Peter? And what if I had said to Jesus, Jesus, how many times do I need to forgive this guy? Right? Is it like 7? Is 7 the magic number here? And I don't know why Peter chose 7. Perhaps it was like me, and like he was already at 7, or maybe he was at 6, and he just needed Jesus to side with him on this one. He was like, you know what? I get it. You're already at 7. You're good. No more, right? But unfortunately, that wasn't the answer that Jesus gave, right? This was one of these teaching moments for Jesus. And so as we look at it, let's look at what Jesus actually said. We find it in Matthew 18, verse 21. It says, Then Peter came to Jesus and asked, Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? Jesus answered this way. He says, I tell you not 7 times, but 70 times 7 times. 70 times 7, right? So I'm sure, I can only imagine in this scenario, Peter did what any of us would have done. He pulled out his smartphone and he grabbed his calculator and he figured out real quickly, man, that's 490 times. But then he realized, okay, so 490, I got it, 490. Once I'm at 490, I don't have to forgive anymore, right? That was the message here. Not at all. Not at all the message, right? What Jesus was really trying to tell us was there isn't a number. It's such an absurd number that there isn't a number, right? Stop counting was really what he was trying to tell us, is quit counting. Put it past. Keep forgiving and forgiving and forgiving. Now, in Jesus' day, it was kind of an interesting culture, interesting society that they lived in. The Jewish folks that lived in his community, they did everything very legalistic. They had sets of rules and laws and rituals and checklists and things that they had to do a certain way. And one of the crazy man-made rules that they had was that if you wronged me 3 times, I had to forgive you 3 times. But once you wronged me the 4th time, I was sort of off the hook. I didn't have to forgive you anymore at that point. And I think this was one of these teaching moments where Jesus looked at this. He knew the people, he knew the culture, he knew what Peter was getting at. And I think what Jesus was trying to tell him was, guys, once again, as in so many other occasions, you got it wrong. You got this one wrong. You need to forgive. And for some of you, you might have been raised reading the Lord's Prayer, right? You might have recited this. You might have memorized this as a child, perhaps. I know when I was a kid, we didn't attend church regularly on a Sunday, but I knew the Lord's Prayer, right? It was one of these things. Now, I couldn't tell you probably what any of it meant, but I could say it, right? And that was probably good enough, at least in my household, to be able to say it. And it's interesting, as you read through it, I don't know if you've ever broken it down, but you see, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Or in some versions you might see, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us, right? And when you look at that verse 12, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Right? That's a really interesting choice of words there. And when I look at that, you're probably like me, and certainly as a kid, I would have looked at that and said, well, this isn't very applicable to me because I don't ever trespass, and I don't owe anybody any money, so it must not be about me, right? I don't trespass, and I don't have any debts. Okay, well, I was wrong again. And what he was really trying to tell us here is trespassing and debts was just one more word for sin. Okay, what he was really telling us is, we're asking God to say, forgive us, forgive my sins the same way that I'm willing to forgive those that sin against me. Wow, that's kind of a dangerous prayer to ask, right? Think about what you're asking there. Are you really asking that? Is that really what you want to bring on? And it's so important that we grasp this. But, what you're asking God is you're saying, God, would you forgive me the same way that I forgive that person that I was just talking about in my office? Would you go ahead and extend forgiveness to me to the same degree that I have extended it to my ex-wife and my ex-husband? Would you go ahead and extend me forgiveness to the same degree that I forgive that person that continues to wrong me? Over and over and over, that person that continues to wrong me. Right? Because we all know it's easy to forgive the person that didn't mean to hurt you. Right? The person that comes to you and says, they hurt you, and they come to you and they're apologetic and they say, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you. Very easy to extend forgiveness to that person. But what about the person that meant to hurt you and plans to hurt you again? Right? How do you extend forgiveness to that person? And Jesus goes on in his teachings, and we find in verse 14 and 15, it says, for if you forgive other people when they sin against you, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others of their sins, your Father will not forgive you of your sins. Well, that's a pretty good thing to know, right? That's a pretty important part of this talk today, in that we are required to forgive others in order to accept God's forgiveness. Okay? That is a commandment, essentially. We are asked to do that by God. Now, you can ask yourself, here's an important question to find out for yourself. If you were on trial today and the charge was that you are a forgiving Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? Right? Would anybody recognize that you're actually a forgiving Christian? That's a great way to sort of look at this and unpack this and say, how do I relate to that? Now, point number 2 on your outlines. We can expect forgiveness only when we forgive others. Okay? Only expect to be forgiven to the same degree that you're willing to extend it to others. Now, some of you today, you might be sitting out there saying, well, John, that's not me. I don't struggle to forgive others. Okay? That's really not my issue. I don't have anybody that I need to forgive. But really what my struggle is I wonder if I'm forgiven. I struggle to find out if I'm forgiven and to recognize that I could possibly be forgiven. Some of you might be sitting here today saying, John, you don't know me, but I've done so many things wrong in my life that there's no way I could ever be forgiven. Right? If that's you today, there's hope. You can be forgiven. And I'd like to, before I share a story out of the Bible that relates to that very topic, I'd like to share another personal story. And some of you may know my son, Elijah, right? If any of you have met him, he's a little guy, 6 years old. Terrific guy, and he's just a wonderful little man. He thinks he's an evangelist. Like, I think he wants like his own TV evangelist show. Everybody he runs into, he tells about Jesus. Like, he will be on the playground and he will be convincing other kids that they need to find and follow Jesus. It's truly remarkable. And the other day, he did something that was so out of character for Elijah. He had never done it, and that's why it caught me so off guard. He lied to me. Right? And it wasn't like this huge lie, but it was a lie nonetheless. He took a snack. He wasn't supposed to take a snack. He ate the snack, and then he told me he didn't do it, right? Pretty serious offense there in my house, right? And so I did what any good dad would do, and I clearly explained to him that the wages of sin are death. Now get to bed. I didn't do that. It's not quite how I handled it. But I sat down and I talked to him. And I did explain to him that this is a sin, and he knew, but I explained to him it was a sin. I explained to him that he had done something wrong, and this actually was one of God's 10 commandments, and we kind of walked through it and explained it to him. And honestly, I probably didn't handle it as well as I should have. And you know, our previous series that we were going through where we have to pick our word, it's no secret. My word is patience, right? And I need a lot of it, so I hope you're all praying for me in that area. But I didn't handle it great. And you know, but we moved past it, and my son went to bed, and a few days had gone by. I had forgotten all about it. I had moved past it, and my son just wasn't himself. He was sort of still hanging on to this a bit, and wasn't being himself. And what I came to find was he was still holding on to this. And I sat down one night, and we were going to do our prayer before we go to bed, and he looked at me and he said, "Dad, have you forgiven me?" And it really, I mean, it blew me away. I was like, at first I didn't even know what he was talking about. And then it occurred to me, and I thought, wow, you know, holy smokes, he was still hanging on to this. He was still living with this on him, this burden, this weight that had been placed on him. And so, you know, of course I had forgiven him, but he needed to hear it. I hadn't actually said the words. He needed to know that I had forgiven him, and that probably more importantly, that Jesus had forgiven him. And it brings me to my last story here. You know, there's a story I'll go through quickly in the Bible. It's a story that it ties right into this, and it's called the prodigal son. And it was a story it was a parable that Jesus told, and you find this in Luke 15. And just a quick summary of the story. There was a dad, there was a father, and he had two sons. We're going to focus on one son for purposes of this. And his son one day came to the dad, and he said, essentially, "Dad, I want my inheritance." Now, you guys all know that typically when you get your inheritance is when your parents die, right? So by coming to your parent and saying, "Can I have my money now? Can I have my inheritance today?" It was sort of like saying, "You are dead to me, but can I go ahead and have my money anyway? Okay, you're dead, I'm moving on, give me my money." Well, his dad did it, surprisingly. I can't imagine, but his dad gave him the money. And so here the prodigal son, he heads off, and he goes out and he squanders his money, the Bible tells us. He lived sort of the life of a rock star, you know, kind of this Vegas lifestyle. He partied, he had women, he had parties, he had gambling, all of these things. And eventually, he ran out of money. And when he ran out of money, the party stopped and the friends left, right? How often does that happen in people's lives? All the time. And pretty soon, he found himself in a humbled position where he didn't have anything, not even food to feed himself. And he thought, I'm going to crawl my way back home, and I'm going to ask my father to forgive me. And I'm going to ask him in such a way that I'm going to say, "Father, at least take me back as a servant on your land. If nothing else, I'd rather be a servant than live the way I'm living today." And as he's walking home to his father's house, he's sort of rehearsing this out loud, and he's thinking, what am I going to say, and how am I going to say it? And he's kind of role-playing it. And as he gets to a distance from the house, pretty soon, his father sees him off in the distance. And the Bible tells us that he actually ran to him, and he didn't even let his son get the words out. He had already forgiven him. He embraced him, pulled him in, forgave him, called for a robe, called for sandals on his feet, the family ring. Let's throw a party and kill the fattened calf, because that's what we all do at parties, right? And that's what he did. And he embraced him. And the summary of the story, you guys, is that the Father in this parable is our Heavenly Father. And what he's telling us here is so important for every one of us to understand, is that no matter how far down the path we have gone, no matter how much wrong we have done in our life, no matter how much we've turned from God, He always loves us. And He is always willing to accept us back when we're ready to come back. And I think that is an incredible story for us to remember at all times. Remember that you can't go far enough off the cliff that God can't rescue you. Jesus told us, or we find in Romans 5:8 in the Bible, it says, "But God shows His love for us in that while we were still sinners, He died for us." It doesn't say here that once we all deserved it, He went ahead and went to the cross for us. He said, while we were still messed up and screwed up and sinners and hopeless, He died for us, for every one of us. And Jesus tells us here, point 3 I think is so important for us. Point 3 on your outline is that we can be forgiven even when we don't deserve it. There is forgiveness for us even when we don't deserve it. And while Jesus was being beaten, while He was nailed to a cross in those last moments of His life, the last words that He was willing to throw out there as they were hurting and torturing Him was, "Father, forgive them, for they don't even know what they're doing." Right? Always trying to teach us, always trying to lead us down a path to the ultimate goal, and that was forgiveness. And he showed us through His death and His resurrection on the cross how easy it is to find and follow Him and to be forgiven. And he tried to take away all the man-made hurdles, all the rituals, all the laws, all the rules, and just made it simple for us to find and follow Him and accept Him. All we need to do is turn from our sin and accept Jesus as our Lord and Savior to be forgiven. So I'd like to give everybody an opportunity to do that today. I know many of you have already made that choice. But if there's anybody in here, even one person in here today, that hasn't made the choice, today's your day. Don't let there be one more day. Today is the day.